The chamber doors opened with the kind of slowness that governments mistake for dignity. Archivist Speaker Thalen Marrow had seen 62 applicant species cross the black floor of the Accord Hall in his 193 years of service, and he had rejected or delayed most of them with the same measured voice he used to announce budget revisions and memorial observances. The hall was built to make small civilizations feel smaller. The ceiling vanished upward into shadow. The walls were cut from polished asteroid basalt that reflected nothing clearly. Even footsteps sounded temporary in that room, as if the stone itself was politely informing visitors that history belonged to those already seated. He adjusted the record slate in front of him and looked toward the doors as species number 63 entered. There were 3 humans. 2 male, 1 female, all in dark formal attire that had clearly been prepared with care and then worn for too many anxious hours. The woman walked in front. She was not tall by galactic standards, not physically imposing, and not dressed in the layered ceremonial fabrics preferred by the elder powers. She wore a simple navy suit with a silver clasp at the throat and carried a hard-case portfolio against her ribs with both hands, as though if she relaxed her grip even slightly the whole moment might slip away from her. Her name, according to the docket, was Ambassador Ilara Ven of the Human Sovereign Office. Thalen watched her cross the floor. He noticed details because that was his profession. The left shoulder of her jacket had been brushed twice and still carried 1 pale line of lint visible only under chamber light. Her shoes had been polished by hand. Her expression was controlled, but the muscles near the jaw worked once when she reached the speaker's mark. Not fear, he thought. Effort. A different thing. More respectable. Usually less useful. She began in high concord, which was correct protocol. Her accent was not good. Not insulting. Not careless. Just slightly wrong in the particular way of someone who had learned from recordings and grammar tablets rather than childhood immersion. Her vowels landed half a step too carefully. The consonants came a fraction late, as though she had built each word in private long before daring to speak it aloud in public. Thalen marked this automatically. They studied hard, he wrote. They were not taught by anyone who wanted them fluent. The human ambassador introduced her delegation, thanked the assembly for hearing her petition, and began her case for provisional membership status under Outer Community Charter. It was, Thalen admitted privately, one of the better applications he had heard. Humanity controlled 29 settled worlds and administered 11 more under cooperative frontier agreements. They maintained 3 deep corridor rescue networks at their own expense. Their epidemiological teams had contained 2 fungal spillovers before either could reach trade lanes inside Accord jurisdiction. They had mapped unstable jump shadows in the Hadran Reach and published the routes openly instead of selling priority access. They had delivered grain, atmospheric filters, and power cores to systems that were not theirs because those systems had needed help and there had been ships available to send. She did not oversell any of it. That was what interested him. Most new species asked to be seen as grander than they were. Humans, it seemed, had chosen the riskier strategy of being exact. 11 minutes into the presentation, Delegate Serrick of the Lore interrupted. The interruption was graceful. That was what made it cruel. Before the petition proceeds, Serrick said, without looking at the human ambassador at all, has the delegation submitted Annex 4 Kappa with mineral sovereignty attestations in physical duplicate? Ambassador Ven paused. Not long. Not enough to be called hesitation by anyone inclined to be kind. We submitted Annex 4 Kappa digitally with seals from all recognized colonial authorities, she said. In physical duplicate, Serrick repeated. There was. Thalen felt the familiar shape of it settling into the room. Not rejection. Not yet. Something cleaner and far more deniable. Procedure. The favored weapon of civilizations too proud to call themselves afraid. Ambassador Ven opened the hardcase portfolio. Thalen could see the neat stacks inside, tabbed, indexed, aligned by color. The human man to her right leaned very slightly toward her, not speaking. She checked one page, then another. We were not informed physical duplicate was required for preliminary review, she said. The requirement was added in the latest clerical revision. When? 19 days ago. A silence followed that would have broken many species. Thalen had seen fury before. He had seen tears, threats, and once a representative from the Serene Marches attempt to overturn a delegate table with both lower arms while shouting that the process was fixed from the beginning. The Serene representative had been correct. The shouting had not helped. Ambassador Ilara Ven only closed the folder. Not sharply. Not theatrically. Gently. "I understand," she said. Thalen did not like that she understood. It made the chamber feel smaller. She thanked Ser Rick for the clarification. Thanked the assembly for their time. Thanked the record office for processing the petition to this stage. Every word sounded like she meant it, which was either a remarkable act of discipline or something sadder and older than discipline. The delegation turned to leave. The male on her left kept his face empty. The one on her right looked straight ahead with the rigid stillness of someone holding a door shut inside himself. The ambassador never once broke posture. At the threshold, just before the doors swallowed them, she stopped and looked back at the chamber. Not accusingly. Not pleading. She looked the way surveyors look at a difficult piece of ground they intend to cross later with better equipment. Then she walked out. The basalt doors closed. Around the high table, slates lit with side discussions, procedural motions, little private currents of satisfaction and boredom. Ser Rick had already moved on to the next agenda item. The chamber was returning to itself, to the old comfortable machinery of postponement. Thalen did not move for several seconds. Then he lowered his gaze to the private line of his record and added one final note beneath the earlier entry. They will return. He did not yet know that the galaxy's next 2 centuries would be built on the fact that he was right. They returned 127 days later with the physical duplicates. Thalen knew the exact number because he checked when the docket alert appeared on his morning slate, and because some part of him, a part he would not have admitted to colleagues of equal rank, had been waiting to see whether the prediction in his private log would survive contact with reality. It did. Ambassador Ilara Ven entered the Accord Hall wearing the same navy suit in a slightly different cut, as though someone on her world had concluded after the first rejection that the old one had not carried enough authority and had corrected the problem with a tailor rather than a complaint. The silver clasp at her throat was new. The portfolio was thicker. The 2 men behind her were different this time. One was older, with silver threaded through the hair at his temples. The other carried 2 archive cases himself rather than leaving them to an aide or cart, which Thalen noticed because species applying for membership usually arrived determined to look important. Humans, apparently, arrived determined to look prepared. She began again in high concord. The accent was better. Still not elegant. Still marked by the shape of a different native tongue. But improved in the specific, measurable way that told him someone had been practicing every day since the last attempt, perhaps for hours, perhaps with no audience at all. Thalen felt a faint and unwelcome pressure behind his sternum. It resembled respect and therefore had to be handled carefully. She submitted Annex 4 Kappa in physical duplicate as required. She also submitted, without being asked, 3 supporting maps, 7 signed mineral attestations, and a compliance memo addressing the clerical revision Ser Rick had cited during the previous hearing. All of it was indexed. All of it was translated into Concord standard and cross-linked to human internal designation codes. Ser Rick took the packet. He turned 3 pages. Then he said, with the smooth regret of a surgeon announcing a necessary cut, "These copies are not embossed." The chamber was very quiet. Ambassador Ven blinked once. The submission guidance provided to our office specified seal verification, not embossing. The guidance distributed to your office was the summary guidance, Ser Rick said. The full filing code requires physical embossing on all mineral sovereignty attestations submitted by non-member polities. How does one obtain the full filing code? The question was perfectly asked. Not hostile. Not sarcastic. Merely direct. Ser Rick folded one hand over the other. By request. A few of the junior delegates shifted in their seats. Not in protest. In discomfort. There was a difference, and Thalen had spent his entire adult life measuring it. Ambassador Ven stood motionless long enough for Thalen to mark the time unconsciously. 2 seconds. 4. 7. She did not look at her aides. She did not look down at her papers. She looked directly at Sarek with the expression of someone adjusting an internal calculation. Then she smiled. "Then we'll request it," she said. No tremor. No visible strain. Only that same impossible steadiness. Thalen wrote in his private record during the transition to the next agenda item. No waste motion under pressure. They do not flare. They redirect. The full filing code was transmitted to the human embassy that afternoon. It was 1,163 pages long. Most applicant species would have treated that as a polite refusal with more paper. The humans answered in 6 days. Not with a complaint. With questions. 74 of them, numbered, courteous, maddeningly precise. Several identified contradictions between the summary guidance and the full code. 2 pointed out obsolete clauses still referenced by current sections. 1, written in perfect administrative lore script, asked whether subsection 12 regarding non-member embossing standards applied equally to machine-governed client states or only to biologically administered polities. Thalen saw Sarek read that question and go very still for a moment, because the answer was inconvenient whichever way one gave it. The humans were not merely complying now. They were learning the machinery. For months later they returned with embossed copies. 8 weeks after that, with certified territorial abstracts requested by the Records Division. 3 months after that, with atmospheric rights acknowledgments from neighboring corridor offices that had not spoken to one another in 9 years until the human embassy somehow got them all to sign the same page. Then with a census clarification. Then with an annex supporting the census clarification. Then with a revised annex because the first supporting annex had been filed on an orange tab set instead of a blue one, which should not have mattered and did matter because procedure was what the powerful called fear when they needed to wear formal clothes. Through all of it, Ambassador Ven remained exactly the same. She learned names. Not only delegates, clerks, translators, security officers at the inner doors. The old Keth archivist in the lower corridor who had developed a shaking hand and dropped slates twice in the same week. She remembered all of them. She asked after their home systems when storms cut trade. She sent a fruit basket to a Skarran aide whose brood partner had survived a difficult hatching. She thanked the record staff for staying late during the second resubmission cycle, and Thalen later confirmed she had meant that too. This, more than the paperwork, began to trouble him. Most species applying for entry treated the Accord as a fortress to be breached or a stage to be conquered. Humans behaved as if it were already a community they intended to serve, whether admitted or not. A year into the revised filing cycle, a fungal bloom erupted in the Jeth corridor, 3 systems beyond any human-administered zone. The Oversight Committee delayed containment recommendations while arguing over jurisdictional cost-sharing. The human embassy sent research unasked. Ambassador Ven did not even attach a cover note beyond. Thought this might help. The committee used the research. Officially, the mitigation framework emerged from internal review. Unofficially, Thalen watched 3 senior analysts lift human findings line for line and present them back to the chamber in more acceptable accents. No one thanked the embassy. He went home that cycle and opened his private log instead of the official minutes. He stared at the blank field for longer than was efficient. Then he wrote, "They are either the most naive species to enter this chamber or the most disciplined. I no longer believe it is naivety." Outside his quarters, the station's artificial night dimmed the corridor lights by 11% on schedule. Inside, the old diplomat sat with the record open and thought of a human ambassador standing at a podium, being told for the second time that she had nearly done everything right. Nearly, he had learned, did not discourage them. Nearly seemed to instruct them. The first application cycle ended in its 3rd year with a recommendation for extended review. That phrase entered the record with all the harmlessness of powdered glass. Extended review meant the committee had found no disqualifying fault severe enough to justify a formal denial and no courage sufficient to approve a species everyone now understood was competent, persistent, and increasingly difficult to patronize. So the file moved sideways. Sideways was one of the Accord's favorite directions. It looked like motion to anyone not paying close attention. Ambassador Ilara Ven received the notice in the lower ring embassy at a small circular table with 2 cups set between her and Thalen Marrow. The drink she served him was called tea, dark and bitter and carrying the faint scent of something leaf green burned just to the edge of usefulness. He had never acquired the taste, but by then he had learned that refusing human hospitality always felt more discourteous than protocols strictly required. The review board cites unresolved procedural complexity in outer corridor territorial harmonization, he told her. She nodded as though he had informed her rain was likely in a season known for rain. I see. There may be a follow-up request for additional corridor certifications. Of course. He set his cup down more carefully than was necessary. Ambassador, I believe you understand that the review board is not moving quickly. That earned the smallest hint of amusement at one corner of her mouth. No, she said, they're moving exactly as designed. He looked at her then, properly looked, because there was no frustration in the statement. No plea. Only observation. That disturbed him more than anger would have. Anger still argued for the value of the thing denied. Observation implied a colder kind of adaptation. You still intend to continue the petition? Absolutely. Why? It was not an elegant question. It escaped him before he shaped it into something diplomat-safe. Elara then reached for her tea. Because the work still matters. The petition? The relationship, she said. The petition is just the paperwork version. He thought about that long after he left. 3 months later, human epidemiologists quietly contained a blood fever bloom in the Sarin Exchange, where 3 member species had spent 11 days disputing quarantine jurisdiction while cargo crews started dying in sealed holds. Humanity had no standing obligation there. No treaty leverage. No seat in the Accord Health Council. They sent medical ships anyway. The Sarin Exchange survived. The official Accord Bulletin thanked the Health Council for coordinated action and noted assistance from several cooperating border polities. Humanity was not named. Thalen checked the internal appendices. Humanity had supplied 83% of the antiviral substrate. He went to sleep badly that night and dreamed of forms stacked into the shape of a wall. The second application cycle began in year 5. By then Elara Ven spoke High Concord well enough that only an old bureaucrat or an enemy would still hear the seams. Thalen, unfortunately, qualified as the first. He noticed improvement the way a mason notices where pressure leaves a mark in stone. She had rounded the clipped syllables, loosened the cadence, learned when not to sound too careful. He suspected she practiced late and alone because the final remnants of accent always clung to words that mattered most, as if she had gone over them more times than the ordinary ones and worn them thin with effort. She presented revised trade integration models. A fully audited colonial inventory. Transit safety data from relay networks the Accord itself now relied on often enough that several committee chairs had begun referring to them in session as established corridor assets, careful never to say human established. The application was tabled again. This time the justification was strategic demographic imbalance. Humanity, the review board noted, had expanded too quickly relative to several mid-tier member species and should therefore be observed over a longer stabilization interval before voting rights were considered. The interval recommended was 7 to 10 years. Thalen read the board's summary twice, then once more in the private silence of his office. On the third reading he stopped on the phrase too quickly and understood, with a clarity he did not enjoy, that if humanity had expanded slowly the report would have said insufficient scale, and because humanity had expanded quickly it now said excessive scale, and in both cases the outcome would have been the same. He placed the report in the official file. Then he opened his private log and wrote, "They are being evaluated against a moving line. We are calling the motion objectivity." By year 8 the human embassy on the lower ring had become one of the station's fixed facts, like maintenance hum or corridor-like delay near the old freight spine. Delegates who had never voted for humanity sent junior aides there for language help, archival access, and once, memorably, assistance resolving a water reclamation algorithm no member species had been able to stabilize. The humans solved it in 3 days and asked nothing in return except raw system data and permission to publish the corrected model for general use. The permission was granted after debate. The publication, of course, cited the Accord Water Stability Office first. Ambassador Ven never objected. That was not true, Thalen corrected himself privately. She objected rarely and only where objection might materially protect someone smaller than herself. She simply did not object on behalf of her own pride. It was a distinction the chamber neither noticed nor deserved. In year 11, another applicant species arrived. The Illyri were elegant, pale-boned, rich in cultural influence, and backed from first contact by two senior member blocks who found them commercially promising and aesthetically easy to admire. Their application packet contained errors obvious enough that a first-year records clerk should have caught them. It was corrected internally before reaching formal review. Their census audit was accelerated. Their territorial disputes were described as manageable in the context of future integration. Their provisional seat was approved in 9 weeks. Thalen watched the vote from the high table. Then, because some instinct that had grown louder with age now refused to let him ignore these things, he looked up toward the observer gallery. Elara Ven was there. Hands folded in her lap. Posture perfect. Face composed. She watched the board light in favor of a species whose file had been carried across the same system that had made humanity rewrite annexes for years. Around her, the rest of the gallery murmured politely, already shifting to the next thing. She did not move at all. Not until the session ended. When she rose, she smoothed the front of her jacket with one hand and left by the side passage reserved for non-member delegations. No visible bitterness. No visible wound. Only that same devastating control, as if disappointment had long ago stopped being an event and become an element, something she had learned to breathe without coughing. Thalen remained seated after adjournment had been called. Below him, clerks gathered slates. Delegates clustered in self-satisfied knots. The chamber resumed its ordinary pulse. He did not. For the first time in 181 years of service to the Accord, Thalen Marrow looked at the machinery around him and thought not that it was flawed, which all systems were, but that it might be dishonest at the foundation. And once that thought arrived, it did not leave. The next requirement entered the human file in year 12 under Supplemental Membership Harmonization Guidance, which was the kind of phrase designed to arrive already cleaned of blame. It required all applicant species with more than 20 settled worlds to submit bilateral cultural recognition affidavits from neighboring powers verifying that their expansion had not created destabilizing identity pressure in adjacent regions. Thalen read the clause twice. Then he checked the date of amendment. 3 weeks earlier. He checked the authorship chain next, which was more difficult because the committee had routed the language through 2 advisory subgroups and 1 records office to blur its shape. It had come, originally, from a minor Sketh procedural aide with no visible power and excellent instincts for where cruelty could hide if dressed correctly. Thalen leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling of his office for a long time. He was old enough by then that long moments of stillness frightened staff who did not know him well. Age, they thought, looked like silence and immobility. They were wrong. Age looked like movement becoming too expensive to waste. He opened a private folder. He had never kept one before. Not truly. He had private notes, yes, observations, impressions, things not polished enough for formal record. But this was different. This required a title. He looked at the blank field. Then he typed, "Things I notice but cannot change." He hated the name the instant it existed. He kept it anyway. The first entry was the amendment date. The second was the authorship trace. The third was a sentence he revised 6 times before leaving it alone. We are no longer evaluating them. We are managing their position. He closed the file and sent the new requirement to the human embassy. Ambassador Elara Ven replied 41 minutes later. Understood. We'll begin immediately. Nothing else. No protest. No accusation. No helpful reminder that the standard had not existed during the previous 11 years of review and therefore represented, at bare minimum, a bad faith moving target. Just, understood. We'll begin immediately. That reply disturbed him more than anger could have. He went to the lower ring 2 days later on an errand that did not, strictly speaking, require his presence. The official reason was clarification of filing scope. The true reason was that he wanted to see her face when she discussed the new requirement. He wanted, though he would not have admitted this even to himself in clear language, to test whether some part of the human calm had a bottom. The embassy door was open. It usually was. Humans treated space the way gardeners treated soil. If they occupied a place long enough, warmth began appearing in corners no architecture had planned for. The lower ring suite had once been a rental block with white walls and indifferent light. Now it held framed star charts, 2 soft chairs with visible wear on the arms, a rack of real paper folders labeled in 3 languages, and a kitchen area that smelled faintly of citrus and burned beans. Ilara Ven was at the central table with 4 stacks of documents arrayed around her like fortification walls. "You came yourself," she said when she saw him. "I was nearby." She smiled. There was no reason for her to pretend to believe that. She did not pretend. Of course. He sat. One of her aides, a broad-shouldered human named Malik whose title changed every few years without seeming to affect his actual work, brought tea without asking whether either of them wanted it. That implied history. Thalen chose not to examine what kind. "The cultural recognition affidavits," he began. "You understand that the wording allows for indirect attestations if direct territorial authorities are unavailable." "We noticed that," she said. "Most applicants miss it." "We read carefully." He looked at the stacks. "How many neighboring powers do you need signatures from?" 8 formally. 12 if we want no one to claim a procedural blind spot later. She turned one page, made a notation, and continued without visible irritation. 3 of them have not exchanged full diplomatic traffic in decades. 1 refuses all affidavits on principle. 2 will insist on reciprocal review rights they are not actually entitled to. You say that as if the matter is already solved. It isn't solved, she said. It's just work. There it was again. Not optimism. Not denial. Thalen wrapped both hands around the teacup because they needed something to do. Ambassador, he said carefully, have you considered that the process may not be acting on you in good faith? Her eyes lifted from the page and settled on him with the same unnerving steadiness he remembered from the very first hearing. Yes, she said. No hesitation. No diplomatic fog. Yes. He had not, he realized, expected honesty that direct. Then why continue? She was quiet for a moment. Not because she lacked the answer. Because she was deciding how much of it to give him. Because our file is not the only thing being built, she said at last. He felt the skin along his arms tighten. In what sense? In every sense that matters later. Before he could press, Malik returned with an updated traffic slate and murmured something about corridor outbreaks in a voice too low for formal eavesdropping. Ilara took the slate, scanned it, and sighed. What is it? Thalen asked. A pressure fever bloom in the Selin transit habitats, she said. Small one, probably containable. That is Accord territory. Yes. You are sending people anyway. It was not a question. She tilted her head very slightly, acknowledging that he understood at least that much. The people in the habitats are real whether the jurisdiction is ours or not. Thalen sat there in the soft lowering light with the tea cooling between his hands and watched her sign a deployment authorization for a disease response team that would travel into territory governed by institutions currently manufacturing obstacles for her petition. He thought, with a sudden shame so clean it felt almost medicinal, I do not know what category to place this in. Not submission. Not manipulation. Not strategy alone. Something else. Something worse for the people mistaking it. When he returned to his office, he opened the private folder and added another line beneath the earlier entries. The error may be mine. I keep looking for the point at which they stop meaning their courtesy. Then, after staring at that sentence for a long time, he added one more. I am beginning to suspect the courtesy is not the mask. It is the species. Thalen did not see the ledger all at once. That would have been too merciful. He saw it first as a reference number in the footer of a transmission he was not supposed to notice. The message had come through one of the lower priority interoffice channels that senior delegates were technically above reading and in practice sometimes read because age teaches you that the most important things in a bureaucracy usually travel disguised as clerical debris. The transmission itself was dull. Corridor outbreak assistance. Resource allocation. Medical routing. But at the bottom, under the standard distribution field and above the document checksum, was a line that read attached per standing historical record, file continuity maintained. File continuity maintained. The phrase bothered him. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was not. It sounded old. Repeated. Used often enough that nobody writing it expected anyone to pause over it. Thalen paused. He keyed the attachment trace. Access denied. That in itself meant little. Half the station's documents were access denied to someone. Access control was what institutions did when they wanted to feel like memory was a privilege rather than a burden. But this access denial had human encryption on it, and human encryption had become notorious in quiet circles over the previous decade for being irritatingly elegant. The refusal notice was polite. It cited no offense. It merely informed him that the document belonged to the Human Sovereign Office archival chain and was unavailable outside authorized reciprocity protocols. Reciprocity. There was a word there too. He sat in his office with the locked file prompt glowing softly above his desk and thought about the phrase Elara Venn had used in the embassy. Our file is not the only thing being built. He closed the prompt. Then he reopened it. He did not try to break the encryption. He was old, not stupid. Human systems logged curiosity the way other species logged intrusion, and he had not survived 214 years in diplomacy by leaving fingerprints on doors he could not open. Instead, he went to the lower ring. The human embassy looked the same as it always did. Light where the station preferred shadow. Order without sterility. A sense, impossible to quantify and therefore offensive to several major species design principles, that the rooms had been arranged for people rather than authority. Elara Venn was not there. She was in the Cell transit habitats, according to the aide who opened the door, coordinating fever response because the Accord Health Directorate still had not stopped debating jurisdictional reimbursement formulas. The aide was not Malik this time. Younger. Narrow-faced. Careful in the shoulders. His badge identified him as Deputy Records Liaison Tomas Ilian. I'm here on an archival matter, Thalen said. That sounds serious, Tomas said. Not officially. That usually makes it worse. The line was delivered dry, not insolent. Human humor often arrived in the same tone as procedural commentary, which made it hazardous for species who believed tone should announce intent clearly. Thalen held out his slate. I saw a reference note. Standing historical record. File continuity maintained. Tomas looked at the slate. Then at Thalen. Then back at the slate. For one brief moment the young human's expression changed in a way Thalen had learned to watch for in diplomats and officers both. Not surprise. Assessment. A very rapid calculation of what had happened, what the other person already knew, and what future shape the conversation might take depending on the next sentence. That file isn't public, Tomas said. I gathered. It isn't classified either. That is a strange category. It's a human category, Tomas said. Those tend to be strange from the outside. Thalen could have left then. The prudent thing would have been to leave. The old diplomatic instinct in him, trained across centuries, told him that if the document mattered this much and had been hidden this carefully, seeing it would alter some balance he still depended on. Instead he heard himself ask, how long has it existed? Tomas was quiet. Then he said, since Ambassador Venn's first year. Not this Ambassador Venn. Thalen understood that immediately and felt his pulse shift. Elara, he asked. No, Tomas said. Dara. The first one. The woman in the navy suit. The almost right pronunciation. The stillness in the corridor after the vote. Something cold and exact moved through him. Tomas seemed to read enough of that on his face to soften, though human softness rarely looked like yielding. It looked more like deciding to stop withholding. Come in, he said. The records room was smaller than Thalen expected and much more physical. Shelves. Boxes. Hard copy binders. Scanned copies of older pages preserved in transparent sleeves. He had known, abstractly, that humans kept paper longer than most species. He had not understood until that moment that the habit was philosophical. A record, the room seemed to say, should be able to survive a power outage. Tomas keyed open a central archive table and turned the display so Thalen could see it. The file index expanded across the surface, not as one document but as a chain. Entry 1. Entry 2. Entry 3. Thousands. The title was plain. Administrative and Material Accounting of Deferred Recognition, Procedural Obstruction, Resource Extraction, and Uncompensated Contribution Relating to Human Sovereign Petitions, Territories, Infrastructure, and Associated Harm. Thalen read it twice. No rhetoric, he said before he meant to. Tomas gave the smallest shrug. It wasn't written for rhetoric. He opened the first entry. Session number. Present delegates. Nature of interruption. Specific procedural basis cited. Corrective action required. Estimated cost in time, travel, material preparation, translation labor, and diplomatic opportunity. Then the next. Then the next. The file moved year by year with the terrible calm of rainfall in a place already flooding. Denials. Delays. Added requirements. Contradictory guidance. Duplicate certifications. Redundant audits. Trade lane fees. Emergency petitions received and tabled. Disease responses provided and uncredited. Corridor beacons built under conditional access agreements later used as leverage against the builders. Resource losses in disputed systems measured against fines too small to be called serious by anyone not living on the affected worlds. There was no anger in the prose. That was the wound. If the file had accused, it would have been easier to defend against. If it had shouted, he could have said it was written by aggrieved people seeking vindication. But it did neither. It simply counted. Dates. Amounts. Effects. Names. Committee language quoted exactly and then translated into consequence. He reached an entry from Year 6. Selin Transit Habitat's Fungal Pressure Event. Human Medical Contribution. 83% antiviral substrate and 61% deployed personnel. Official Accord Public Acknowledgement. None. Secondary effect. Strengthening of local trade corridor stability benefiting 4 member species. Material reimbursement requested. No. Material reimbursement offered. No. The next entries continued. Year 8. Year 10. Year 11. Then the vote approving the ILLRI in 9 weeks. Comparative processing interval added as an appendix. Not dramatized. Just placed beside humanity's ongoing file with the sort of composure only mathematicians and the deeply injured could manage. Thalen became aware, dimly, that he had been standing for a very long time. Sit down, Tomas said. He did. The chair was ordinary. Human-made. Functional. It held his weight without ceremony. How many pages? Thalen asked. 4,112 in the current chain. The number hit him strangely. Not as size. As time. This is all real? Tomas looked at him with something that was not contempt and not quite pity. Every line. Why keep it? The young human considered that. Not because he lacked the answer. Because he was trying to choose the precise one. So that someday, he said, nobody can say it was vague. Thalen looked back at the archive table. At page after page of harm rendered in bureaucratic language, so exact it became unbearable. At a species he had thought patient, perhaps too patient, and now had to understand differently. Not patience. Memory with filing discipline. He reached the most recent page. The final entry was only 2 lines long. Seth Corridor Extraction Event appended. Difference between assessed fine and estimated value taken. 2,996,000,000 credits. Beneath that, in a different hand and under a date 6 months old, was a note. We are close enough now to stop calling this a record and start calling it preparation. Thalen stared at that line until the archive table dimmed slightly from lack of touch input. Then, very softly, because there was no one in the room to impress and because truth sounds smaller when it first arrives, he said, "We have been teaching you." Tomas did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried no triumph at all. "No," he said. "You've been giving us evidence." The triggering event arrived, as such things often did, wrapped in legality. It concerned the Hadran Reach, a line of 8 human-settled worlds on the outer edge of mapped Accord space, Mineral poor by old survey standards and therefore ignored for 40 years until a new generation of jump field engineering discovered that the black stone under their northern continents could stabilize long-distance lane apertures at 1/3 the standard energy cost. Once the black stone mattered, the reach became contested. This was also legal. The Accord had a framework for contested territories. It had 7 frameworks, in fact, depending on whether the dispute involved population continuity, prior survey rights, extraction history, military occupation, pilgrimage relevance, or any 2 of those at once. The Hadran Reach, being inhabited by humans for 4 generations and suddenly valuable to 3 member species who had never previously shown curiosity about it, qualified under the most useless framework available, active claim review pending resource neutrality determination. Resource neutrality determination sounded fair. In practice, it meant the claim would be studied while extraction was allowed under temporary parity permissions. Temporary parity permissions sounded cautious. In practice, they meant the larger power got there first. The larger power, in this case, was the Vrock Combine. Their harvest ships entered Hadron orbit in a line of 12, broad-backed and ugly, painted in the matte industrial yellow favored by species that wanted machinery to look inevitable. They did not fire. They did not deploy soldiers. They filed notice with the Accord Resources Board 43 minutes before beginning atmospheric descent and cited Clause 14, subsection 12, emergency non-destructive extraction rights in economically significant disputed zones pending final territorial clarification. Everything about it was clean. That was what made it obscene. 211,000 humans lived across the 8 worlds of the Reach. Most were farmers, rig workers, and infrastructure crews. Their grandparents had broken those worlds open with fusion cutters and weather towers. Their dead were in that soil. Their schools, transit rails, flood walls, and oxygen groves were in that soil. Their legal status, according to the Accord, was currently under review. The Vrock began cutting on a Monday. By Wednesday, 2 valleys on Hadron 4 had been opened down to the Blackstone seam. By Friday, the sky above Hadron 6 carried a permanent haze from industrial lift engines. By the end of the second week, colony traffic cameras were full of images humans had learned over 2 centuries to endure and never mistake for anything except what they were, strangers growing rich on the assumption that procedure would outrun outrage. The Human Sovereign Office filed an emergency petition. Thalen saw it arrive. He saw the priority markers, the population impact projections, the attached colonial testimony, the photos from Hadron 4, where one extraction team had laid its approach track within visible distance of a memorial field because the topography made it cheaper. The petition requested immediate suspension of all Vrock activity pending adjudication. It was routed to the Emergency Review Subcommittee. The Emergency Review Subcommittee met every 30 days. Thalen read that routing notice twice, then closed his eyes for a moment and pressed the heel of one hand against them until light flashed red in the dark. When he lowered his hand, the notice was still there, calm as a murder record filed alphabetically. He went to the committee offices in person. That alone caused disruption. Senior Keth delegates did not go in person to clerical wings unless a government was collapsing or a funeral needed signatures. The records aide at the outer desk rose so quickly her chair tipped over behind her. "I need the Hadron petition elevated," he said. The aide swallowed. "Speaker Marrow, the petition is already in emergency channel. It is not emergency if the review waits 30 days. That is the committee's mandated interval. Then the mandate is broken." She looked at him with the mute terror of the junior functionary asked to adjudicate between age, rank, and procedure. "I can flag it for early consideration." "How early?" 7 days if the chair agrees." 7 days. Thalen thought of 12 Vrock harvest ships, of memorial fields, of a ledger now 4,000 pages long because 7 days and 30 days and 11 months were the units in which polite theft had always measured itself. "Flag it," he said. The chair did not agree. The subcommittee met on schedule, 30 days after the first drills touched Blackstone. By then the VROC had removed or worth 3.2 billion credits and displaced 19,000 humans from 3 colonial districts under hazard prevention ordinances drafted by lawyers who had never seen those districts and never intended to. The ruling came down in 19 pages. The extraction activity, while regrettable in its social consequences, remained technically compliant within temporary parity permissions. The committee recommended continued negotiation. The VROC Combine was fined 6 million credits for memorial site disruption and procedural discourtesy toward local administration. Procedural discourtesy. Thalen read that phrase and felt, for the first time in living memory, the urge to tear a document with his own hands. He did not. He forwarded the ruling to the lower ring. He did not add commentary. There was no commentary in the world adequate to the insult. 2 hours later he went there himself. The embassy door was open again. It always was. The records room lights were on. He found Tomas Ilian at the archive table, one sleeve rolled up, entering figures with the absolute focus of a medic closing a wound. "Is Ambassador Ven here?" Thalen asked. "No. She's in transit to Hadran 6. "Of course she is." Tomas nodded once and continued typing. Thalen moved closer despite himself. On the archive surface the newest entry was already open. The VROC Temporary Parity Extraction Action. Population displaced. Estimated material value removed. Committee fine. Difference between value taken and penalty assessed. The final line was still blank. Tomas filled it in without drama. 3,194,000,000 credits. He saved the entry. The number settled into the chain as if it had always been waiting for that exact place. "You record it that quickly?" Thalen asked. Tomas looked up. "We stopped leaving gaps a long time ago." Something in the young human's face stopped him from offering apology. Apology would have been too small, and both of them knew it. "What happens now?" Thalen asked. Tomas leaned back from the table. Not far. Just enough to become, for 1 second, less a clerk and more what he actually was. One moving part inside a machine that had been under construction for generations. He opened a secure side channel. The header carried human sovereign office routing markers Thalen could not fully parse. Tomas typed a message only 6 words long. "How close are we now?" He sent it. They waited. The reply came back in 4 minutes and 19 seconds. "Closer than they think. Begin sequence review." Thalen read the line once. Then again. No anger. No surprise. No panic. Just readiness entering the room and taking its coat off. Tomas closed the channel, logged the correspondence to the historical record, and filed it under continuity maintained. Then he looked at Thalen with a tired, almost gentle steadiness that reminded him so sharply of Ilara Ven at the podium that for a moment age and time collapsed into one unbearable point. "We were hoping," Tomas said, "that they'd stop before we had to use what comes next." Outside the embassy, the station lights cycled toward evening. Inside, beside a ledger built line by line across decades of composure, Thalen Marrow finally understood that patience had never been the delay between injury and response. Patience had been the response. And somewhere far beyond the Accord sphere, in systems that had spent 200 years being filed, fined, interrupted, reviewed, and politely denied, something vast and meticulously organized had just received permission to stop waiting. The first visible sign was not a fleet. It was paperwork. On a Tuesday that began like any other Tuesday in the Accord sphere, 312 human diplomatic personnel across member space filed administrative leave requests within the same 9-minute window. Not resignations. Not protests. Standard leave. Correct codes. Correct notice intervals. Medical contingencies addressed. Housing transfers documented. Every request routed through the proper channels with supporting references and clean signatures in both physical and digital form. The administrative system processed them automatically. It had been built to survive incompetence, fraud, panic, and 3 separate cyberplagues across its lifetime. It was not built to detect coordinated legal withdrawal by a species that had spent 2 centuries learning every seam in its design. By midday, junior clerks in 4 sectors had begun sending quiet queries up their chains. By evening, the The Central Records Division noticed a secondary pattern. Human technical liaisons attached to corridor maintenance bureaus were also filing end-of-obligation notices. Not all of them. Not yet. The first wave was small, almost deniable. A relay calibration specialist on the Eridian spine. 2 beacon auditors in the Jeth corridor. A 6-person diagnostics team assigned to the Old Karth shipping lattice. All of them citing the same thing. Contractual review completed. Conditional maintenance obligations suspended pending transit and sovereignty clarification. The wording was immaculate. Thalen saw the phrase 3 times before he understood what it meant, and when he did he sat very still in his office and felt something like vertigo pass through him. Not because the move was loud. Because it was elegant. It reached backward into contracts signed 40 and 50 years earlier, into clauses no one had read carefully because no one had imagined humans would ever need to rely on them. They had read them. Of course they had. He pulled the Eridian Maintenance Charter first. Article 19, Paragraph 4, buried under 12 pages of cross-jurisdictional servicing language. Human sovereign maintenance obligations for relay and beacon infrastructure shall remain active only while human sovereign transit rights and fee status remain materially uncontested under operating law. Materially uncontested. The corridor levy disputes were still under review. The fees were still being assessed. Human ships were still paying to use routes humans had built. Therefore the obligations were void. Not morally. Not rhetorically. Legally. Thalen opened 3 more contracts. The same architecture appeared in all of them, phrased differently, translated through different eras of drafting style, but present. Conditional access. Conditional support. Conditional technical continuity. Humanity had written itself an exit 2 generations ago and then waited with astonishing civility for the rest of the galaxy to force them to use it. By second cycle, the Sketh Commerce Bureau had noticed. Delegate Sarek himself called the Infrastructure Committee floor, which meant panic had climbed past the level where it could be outsourced to assistants. Thalen took the call because nobody else in his office was old enough to hide their alarm. "This is a negotiating tactic," Sarek said without greeting. "No," Thalen said. "It is a regulatory compliance measure." He did not mean to echo the human line exactly. Sarek heard it anyway. There was a pause on the channel, and in that pause Thalen imagined, not without satisfaction, the Sketh delegate recognizing his own language turned back on him wearing a different face. They cannot simply abandon corridor infrastructure. They have not abandoned it. They filed transfer notices. Transfer to whom? That, Thalen said, appears to be under review. He ended the call before Sarek could answer. It was the first time in 214 years he had ever closed a line in anger. The withdrawals continued. Human embassy staff left no mess behind. That, more than anything, unsettled the station. Their offices were cleaned. Their pending files were indexed. Handover notes were left for clerks who had spent years pretending not to need their help. Open mediation channels were closed with polite notices. Cultural attaches sent brief personal messages to counterparts thanking them for prior conversations and wishing success in future work. The humans were not slamming doors. They were removing themselves with the precision of surgeons lifting instruments from a tray. The lowering embassy changed first in ways only regular visitors would notice. Fewer voices. More empty desks. Fewer cups left drying by the kitchen sink. Then entire rooms went dark. Translation support disappeared from 2 committee branches that had grown used to asking the human office to reconcile difficult legal phrasing. Public health coordination in 3 outer systems slowed because the human epidemiology teams were still answering emergency distress, but no longer offering free forecast modeling in advance. Small things at first. Small things are how systems announce they are beginning to bleed. Then the relay transfers started landing in batches. Station 7 Gamma. Beacon Spine Delta 4. Eridian Corridor Nodes 11 through 18. Jeth Navigation Cluster East Array. Maintenance histories complete. Repair schedules attached. Calibration documentation included. Operator notes included. Training support available on request subject to standard processing time. The files were massive. They were also unreadable without human technical interpretive software. Not encrypted. Not hidden. Merely written in a proprietary engineering syntax developed over 40 years of real-world maintenance by people who built systems to be serviced by those who had built them. The documentation was all there. Every repair, every anomaly, every workaround, every physical map of component drift under certain radiation seasons. It was just that the language of that knowledge belonged to the hands that had accumulated it. Requests for interpretive software were submitted within hours. The Human Sovereign Office acknowledged receipt promptly. Processing time, 60 standard days. One Sketh subminister filed an urgent duplicate request and received a notice that duplicate filings while an active request was open created a procedural conflict that must be resolved before either request could proceed. The notice thanked him for his patience. He did not appreciate the wording. Markets began noticing before politicians did. The Aridian corridor dropped to 73% throughput in 12 days. Then 61. Then half. Half capacity meant waiting lanes. Waiting lanes meant delayed cargo. Delayed cargo meant perishable stock loss, missed manufacturing windows, and traders screaming into secure channels at ministers who had never before needed to understand how much of their quiet prosperity was riding on human-built infrastructure nobody had thought to respect while it was functioning. Species that had ignored the human withdrawal when it still looked like diplomacy now began asking practical questions in increasingly undiplomatic tones. Who is servicing the corridor relays? Why are the beacon recalibrations late? Why did nobody know the documentation required human software? Why is the software request under review? Because that was the thing the galaxy was only now learning. Humanity had not merely built corridors, cured outbreaks, filed petitions, and paid unfair fees. It had also become the unseen competence inside half the systems that let everyone else feel civilized. And now that competence was stepping back, legally, gently, and with every receipt in order. In the lower ring, Tomas Ilian added each transfer to the ledger. Asset. Dependency impact. Notice period. Requested support. Accord response time. He worked 12-hour cycles and slept at the embassy because going home felt like a poor use of momentum. Thalen found him there one artificial evening surrounded by stacked hard copies and quiet terminal light, entering relay numbers with the expression of a man cataloging weather that had finally arrived after generations of prediction. How many now? Thalen asked. 43 major transfers. 112 minor support withdrawals. 17 embassy closures or partial staff suspensions. 81 technical dependency requests filed back to us by species who spent the last century pretending not to depend on us. And the software? Still under review. Of course. Tomas saved the entry and looked up. Speaker Marrow, with respect, they still think this is pressure. Thalen understood immediately what the sentence meant. Pressure was a tactic. Pressure invited bargaining. Pressure could be relieved. This was not pressure. This was structure rearranging itself to reflect reality after too long pretending to be something else. What is it then? He asked. Tomas closed the archive table with one hand and answered in the same tone he might have used to report shipping totals or corridor weather. Accounting, he said. By the third month, the damage could no longer be described as inconvenience except by people with a professional stake in lying gently. Trade convoys stacked in holding patterns along the Aridian corridor because half the relay lattice was running on outdated calibration assumptions and the Sketh engineers still had not cracked the human maintenance syntax. Ships arrived late to market worlds by days, then weeks. Perishable biotech cultures spoiled in sealed freight. Fuel contracts failed to meet cascade schedules. Insurance rates climbed. 2 mid-tier shipping combines announced temporary suspensions in the Jeff lane after 3 navigation beacon drift events in the same 10-day span forced emergency course corrections near a gravity shear pocket humans had been compensating for manually for 17 years. No one had known that last part. That was what made the silence so ugly. The systems had worked. Therefore, the people benefiting from them had assumed the systems were simple. Simplicity, in galactic politics, was usually just ignorance wearing confidence. The first species to say so aloud were not the great powers. They were the Verithi. Small-bodied, cold-adapted, from a remote moon cluster so far off the primary trade routes that most senior delegates still pronounced their world group wrong despite 20 years of corrected introductions. The Varithi maintained 2 observer seats in the Accord, both non-voting, both usually ignored unless resource allocation quotas needed symbolic consultation. Their representative, Minister Terrell Voss, requested speaking time on a transportation continuity session no one important had intended to attend. The request would ordinarily have been deferred. This time, enough major delegates were suddenly interested in transportation continuity that the chamber was fuller than it had been in weeks. Thalen Marrow took his seat at the upper arc of the old sphere and watched Terrell Voss walk to the floor with a folder so worn at the edges it suggested either poverty or sincerity. Perhaps both. The Accord, the Varithi minister said, in perfectly serviceable concord, has spent the last 3 months speaking as though corridor instability is a technical event. It is not. It is relational debt becoming visible. That sentence changed the room. Not because it was loud. Because it was correct. The Sketh benches stiffened first. Then the Vrock. Then the Keth delegation behind Thalen, who suddenly found documents fascinating on their desk displays. Terrell Voss continued. Small species, she observed, had always understood dependency more clearly than large ones because small species could not afford to mistake help for inevitability. The relay networks, beacon chains, emergency disease screens, language support offices, and quiet human corrections embedded inside half the Accord's daily function had not appeared by natural law. They had been built, maintained, and offered by a polity the chamber had spent 2 centuries informing, politely, procedurally, repeatedly, that its participation remained under review. Then she asked the question no senior delegate had yet dared ask in open session. What did you think they were doing while you kept them waiting? No one answered. Thalen did not move. He did not need to. At his age, stillness had become one of his few remaining dignities. But internally something old and stubborn gave way with a soundless crack. Not because the Varithi minister had said something he did not know. Because she had said it in a chamber built for larger species to pretend smaller ones had nothing instructive to offer. The Brel were next. Then the Kesri League. Then 3 Category 4 applicants still technically under preliminary observation. The messages to the Human Sovereign Office began privately at first, sliding sideways through diplomatic channels that had always been much more alive than the public record admitted. They were cautious, respectful, and almost all variants of the same question. What comes now? Humanity answered fewer of them than the senders expected. It answered more than the great powers deserved. The first formal hint arrived as a filing notice. Of course it did. Director General Mara Solen of the Human Sovereign Office submitted a document to the Accord's Central Registry under Clause 2057 Paragraph 9. A procedural relic so old most current delegates had never read it in full. The filing title was deceptively plain. Notification of Framework Reassessment and Administrative Realignment. It was 11 pages long. That alarmed Thalen more than if it had been 1100. 11 pages meant it had been reduced, distilled, made impossible to misread. He received the filing at 0600 station time, opened it while the light outside his office was still in artificial dawn cycle, and read every page standing up. Humanity, after 203 years of continuous engagement with the Accord framework, had concluded that the existing institutional structure was procedurally asymmetrical, strategically self-protective, and functionally incapable of equitable integration for species lacking pre-existing bloc sponsorship. Therefore, the Human Sovereign Office was initiating transfer to an alternative diplomatic architecture built around reciprocal entry standards, transparent adjudication timelines, uninterrupted speaking protections, and infrastructure obligations linked to enforceable representation. No threat language. No triumph. No insult. Just a statement that the old table had been measured, found warped, and would no longer be trusted to hold weight. Page 7 included a timetable. Page 9 included the names of 6 smaller polities already invited to the preliminary drafting assembly. The Varithi were on it. So were the Tezari, who had spent 31 years under applicant review in the old Accord and had received more paperwork than aid. Also on the list was the Jethari Cooperative, a modest trade culture everyone liked in public and forgot in budget sessions. The great powers were not invited. Not yet. Thalen sat down only after he finished the last page. He stared at the window for a long time. The old sphere rotated beyond it, dignified and unchanged to the eye, while inside every mechanism that mattered had already begun to shift around an absence it had not believed could become power. By midday, the Keth government had sent him 3 messages marked urgent. The Sketh sent 7. The Vrock demanded clarification. Clarification, in the mouths of powers that had spent 30 years using ambiguity as a tax instrument, sounded almost comic now. Thalen replied to none of them. Instead he requested a direct meeting with Director General Solen. He was granted one 6 hours later, not in the chamber, not in the Keth residence arc, but in the lower-ring human offices that now looked less like an embassy and more like a command center disguised as modest rental space. The walls still held star charts. The kitchen still smelled faintly of burned beans. The records room lights were still on. Mara Solen received him standing. She was human, middle-aged, gray threading at the temples, dressed in a plain charcoal jacket with no visible national ornament beyond a small lapel pin. Thalen had to look twice to recognize. A yellow star on green. The old symbol. Ilara Ven's symbol. For 1 second, unbidden, he saw the first ambassador as she had stood at the speaker's mark with imperfect high concord and a folder held too tightly. "I read your filing," he said. "I assumed you would." He looked at her for a long moment. "Is this pressure?" She folded her hands behind her back. "No." He believed her. "Then what is it?" She answered without emphasis, which only made it heavier. "It is the moment after waiting." Outside, somewhere deep in the old sphere structure, a relay alarm chimed because another corridor queue had overflowed into manual routing. Neither of them turned toward the sound. Thalen understood then, with a clarity that felt almost cruel in how late it had arrived, that the galaxy was no longer negotiating with a patient applicant species. It was meeting, at last, the civilization humans had been building in silence while everyone else was busy reviewing their forms. The fleet arrived at 0600 station time exactly. Not approximately. Not within the ordinary tolerance window that navigators called exact because physics was untidy and folded space refused to respect anyone's schedule. Exactly. The station clocks ticked over, and on that same second every sensor array across the Hadran Reach registered the same impossible fact. 2,400 human warships had come out of transit in perfect geometric relation to one another and to the 12 Vrock extraction groups already in orbit above the colony worlds. The first reports reached the old Accord sphere in fragments because no one trusted the first report. Then the fragments began agreeing with one another. Thalen Marrow was in his office when the alert package hit. He opened the first visual feed and saw the human formation hanging over Hadron 4 in complete silence, dark-hulled, unornamented, arranged not for spectacle but coverage. There was nothing flamboyant in it. That was what made it terrible. Spectacle wanted to be seen. This formation had arrived to do a job. A communication channel opened from the human flagship 3 minutes later. The commander who appeared on screen was a human woman in civilian cut black with no metal lines and no performative hardness in her face. Her identification field read Admiral Lena Vasquez, Human Sovereign Defense Fleet, Outer Systems Command. Thalen recognized the name after a moment and remembered the line in the ledger, an auditor's hand on an arm in a cargo bay, a young petty officer looking at the wall because looking at the wall was safer than reacting. Age had sharpened her. Not visibly. Visibly she was composed, compact, almost plain. But the composure had changed quality. It no longer resembled discipline under pressure. It resembled pressure that had learned discipline. The message she sent to the Vrock command was broadcast to the Accord observation lattice in full compliance with interpolity engagement law. This is Admiral Lena Vasquez of the Human Sovereign Defense Fleet. Human civilian populations and recognized territorial infrastructure within the Hadran Reach are under unlawful extraction pressure under cover of unresolved review. You are ordered to suspend all operations, power down heavy industrial systems, and prepare to receive restitution terms. We are not requesting compliance with this instruction. We are informing you that the period in which review functioned as permission has ended. No threat. No countdown. No dramatic language. Just clarity. The Vrock answered in the way large powers answered when they had lived too long inside assumptions that still felt like law. Their lead commander, a broad-necked officer in mineral gold armor, appeared over split screen and cited disputed resource code, active parity permissions, and the right of protected extraction under existing Accord adjudication standards. He referred to the human deployment as an illegal militarization of a contested zone. He demanded immediate withdrawal. Admiral Vasquez listened without interruption. When he finished, she said, "You may continue believing that, if it helps you maintain continuity of self. It will not alter the next 60 seconds. Thalen felt his breath stop. On every screen in the Accord sphere, the Vrock line surged. They had expected bluff or negotiation or at worst a conventional battle in which their larger extraction escorts and reserve heavy cruisers could absorb the first exchange long enough for reinforcement to matter. Their lead ships accelerated hard, weapons arrays waking in bright bands along their hulls. A dozen target paint signatures flooded the tactical feed. In the old sphere, delegates who had spent 200 years telling themselves humanity was industrious but secondary leaned toward their displays at exactly the same angle. The humans did not move. Then the pulse went out. It did not look like a weapon. No beam. No detonations. No blooming shock fronts. Just a spreading distortion in the tactical overlays, so slight that for one irrational instant it seemed the sensors themselves had stuttered. The Vrock front line stopped. Not exploded. Not shattered. Stopped. 86 ships in the Vanguard shell lost thrust, weapons control, and maneuver authority in the same second. Their hull lights remained on. Life support remained on. Emergency stabilization remained on. Crews were unharmed. The ships simply ceased being instruments of power and became, all at once, expensive objects drifting carefully in gravity-balanced silence. The second line checked fire too late and lost targeting lock before they could discharge. A third line, further back, cut engines on its own without being hit at all. The Vrock commander stared at his board for a long time. No one in the old sphere made a sound. The human fleet still had not advanced. Admiral Vasquez opened the channel again. "We have just disabled a fraction of your available hulls without injury to your crews and without damage to your life support systems. We can do the same to the remainder of your fleet, to every extraction platform in Hadran orbit, and to every heavy industrial core currently cutting into colony ground. We are choosing not to because the point of this operation is correction, not humiliation. You have 90 days to restore extracted Blackstone or its equivalent value, withdraw all non-civilian Vrock assets from human-recognized Hadran space, and fund full reconstruction of all damaged memorial, agricultural, and habitation zones. You may ask by what authority we issue these terms." She paused. Then, very calmly, "Our own." The phrase went through the sphere like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. The Vrock commander began to speak, stopped, recalculated, and visibly abandoned the first version of himself he had intended to use in this conversation. When he spoke again, he sounded like what he actually was now, a military officer who had just watched the future arrive and declined to kill him. "If we agree to discuss terms," he said, "will our disabled ships be restored?" "Yes," Vasquez said. There was another pause, and then the smallest thing happened. On the Vrock commander's face, pride gave way not to fear, but to recognition. Recognition that the old math had failed. Recognition that the galaxy had mistaken procedural endurance for technological passivity. Recognition that somewhere, decades earlier, while committees filed motions and revised annexes and tabled votes, humanity had been building the answer to a question no one important had bothered asking. "What happens," he said, "if we refuse?" Admiral Vasquez looked at him the way one professional looks at another when both of them know the answer and only one still needs it spoken aloud. "Then," she said, "we stop being this generous." He talked. Of course he talked. By the time the channel closed, the disabled Vrock ships were being brought back online in controlled sequence, weapons still locked but crews alive and systems stable. The extraction platforms had powered down. Human drones were already entering atmosphere over Hadran 4 carrying survey teams, restitution assessors, and emergency rebuild modules as if the fleet demonstration had been merely the front gate to the real work. On the old sphere, the delegates remained seated long after the feeds went dark. Thalen Marrow looked around the chamber and thought, not for the first time, how often history announces itself quietly and is then misunderstood by people expecting drums. Humanity had just shown the galaxy a weapon 41 years in the making, disabled an occupying fleet without killing its crews, demanded restitution in measured legal language, and returned immediately to reconstruction planning. No triumph. No blood spectacle. No indulgence. Just power, documented and applied with the same exactness with which they had once filed membership forms. Thalen understood then that the old accord had already lost, not at the moment the human fleet arrived, but at the moment it taught a patient species to keep records, build alternatives, and stop confusing politeness with dependence. The fleet arrived at 0600 station time exactly. Not approximately. Not within the ordinary tolerance window that navigators called exact because physics was untidy and folded space refused to respect anyone's schedule. Exactly. The station clocks ticked over, and on that same second every sensor array across the Hadran Reach registered the same impossible fact. 2,400 human warships had come out of transit in perfect geometric relation to one another and to the 12 Vrock extraction groups already in orbit above the colony worlds. The first reports reached the old Accord sphere in fragments because no one trusted the first report. Then the fragments began agreeing with one another. Thalen Marrow was in his office when the alert package hit. He opened the first visual feed and saw the human formation hanging over Hadran 4 in complete silence, dark-hulled, unornamented, arranged not for spectacle but coverage. There was nothing flamboyant in it. That was what made it terrible. Spectacle wanted to be seen. This formation had arrived to do a job. A communication channel opened from the human flagship 3 minutes later. The commander who appeared on screen was a human woman in civilian cut black with no metal lines and no performative hardness in her face. Her identification field read Admiral Lena Vasquez, Human Sovereign Defense Fleet, Outer Systems Command. Thalen recognized the name after a moment and remembered the line in the ledger, an auditor's hand on an arm in a cargo bay, a young petty officer looking at the wall because looking at the wall was safer than reacting. Age had sharpened her. Not visibly. Visibly she was composed, compact, almost plain. But the composure had changed quality. It no longer resembled discipline under pressure. It resembled pressure that had learned discipline. The message she sent to the Vrock command was broadcast to the Accord observation lattice in full compliance with interpolity engagement law. This is Admiral Lena Vasquez of the Human Sovereign Defense Fleet. Human civilian populations and recognized territorial infrastructure within the Hadran Reach are under unlawful extraction pressure under cover of unresolved review. You are ordered to suspend all operations, power down heavy industrial systems, and prepare to receive restitution terms. We are not requesting compliance with this instruction. We are informing you that the period in which review functioned as permission has ended. No threat. No countdown. No dramatic language. Just clarity. The Vrock answered in the way large powers answered when they had lived too long inside assumptions that still felt like law. Their lead commander, a broad-necked officer in mineral gold armor, appeared over split screen and cited disputed resource code, active parity permissions, and the right of protected extraction under existing Accord adjudication standards. He referred to the human deployment as an illegal militarization of a contested zone. He demanded immediate withdrawal. Admiral Vasquez listened without interruption. When he finished, she said, "You may continue believing that, if it helps you maintain continuity of self. It will not alter the next 60 seconds." Thalen felt his breath stop. On every screen in the Accord sphere, the Vrock line surged. They had expected bluff or negotiation or at worst a conventional battle in which their larger extraction escorts and reserve heavy cruisers could absorb the first exchange long enough for reinforcement to matter. Their lead ships accelerated hard, weapons arrays waking in bright bands along their hulls. A dozen target paint signatures flooded the tactical feed. In the old sphere, delegates who had spent 200 years telling themselves humanity was industrious but secondary leaned toward their displays at exactly the same angle. The humans did not move. Then the pulse went out. It did not look like a weapon. No beam. No detonations. No blooming shock fronts. Just a spreading distortion in the tactical overlays, so slight that for one irrational instant it seemed the sensors themselves had stuttered. The Vrock front line stopped. Not exploded. Not shattered. Stopped. 86 ships in the Vanguard shell lost thrust, weapons control, and maneuver authority in the same second. Their hull lights remained on. Life support remained on. Emergency stabilization remained on. Crews were unharmed. The ships simply ceased being instruments of power and became, all at once, expensive objects drifting carefully in gravity-balanced silence. The second line checked fire too late and lost targeting lock before they could discharge. A third line, further back, cut engines on its own without being hit at all. The Vrock commander stared at his board for a long time. No one in the old sphere made a sound. The human fleet still had not advanced. Admiral Vasquez opened the channel again. We have just disabled a fraction of your available hulls without injury to your crews and without damage to your life support systems. We can do the same to the remainder of your fleet, to every extraction platform in Hadran orbit, and to every heavy industrial core currently cutting into colony ground. We are choosing not to because the point of this operation is correction, not humiliation. You have 90 days to restore extracted Blackstone or its equivalent value, withdraw all non-civilian Vrock assets from human-recognized Hadran space, and fund full reconstruction of all damaged memorial, agricultural, and habitation zones. You may ask by what authority we issue these terms. She paused. Then, very calmly, our own. The phrase went through the sphere like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. The Vrock commander began to speak, stopped, recalculated, and visibly abandoned the first version of himself he had intended to use in this conversation. When he spoke again, he sounded like what he actually was now, a military officer who had just watched the future arrive and declined to kill him. If we agree to discuss terms, he said, will our disabled ships be restored? Yes, Vasquez said. There was another pause, and then the smallest thing happened. On the Vrock commander's face, pride gave way not to fear, but to recognition. Recognition that the old math had failed. Recognition that the galaxy had mistaken procedural endurance for technological passivity. Recognition that somewhere, decades earlier, while committees filed motions and revised annexes and tabled votes, humanity had been building the answer to a question no one important had bothered asking. What happens, he said, if we refuse? Admiral Vasquez looked at him the way one professional looks at another when both of them know the answer and only one still needs it spoken aloud. Then, she said, we stop being this generous. He talked. Of course he talked. By the time the channel closed, the disabled Vrock ships were being brought back online in controlled sequence, weapons still locked but crews alive and systems stable. The extraction platforms had powered down. Human drones were already entering atmosphere over Hadran 4 carrying survey teams, restitution assessors, and emergency rebuild modules as if the fleet demonstration had been merely the front gate to the real work. On the old sphere, the delegates remained seated long after the feeds went dark. Thalen Marrow looked around the chamber and thought, not for the first time, how often history announces itself quietly and is then misunderstood by people expecting drums. Humanity had just shown the galaxy a weapon 41 years in the making, disabled an occupying fleet without killing its crews, demanded restitution in measured legal language, and returned immediately to reconstruction planning. No triumph. No blood spectacle. No indulgence. Just power, documented and applied with the same exactness with which they had once filed membership forms. Thalen understood then that the old accord had already lost, not at the moment the human fleet arrived, but at the moment it taught a patient species to keep records, build alternatives, and stop confusing politeness with dependence.